In the past, people have been concerned with the need to adjust the shutter settings in circumstances where there's limited light. If you would, take a look at the f-stop setting on this particular strobe. It's been redesigned in a multicolored etched design in order to facilitate easy visibility.
And finally, we can see that the high cost of the existing system has been and will continue to be of major concern. We'll get to that in just a minute. Before we talk about this chart, I think it's important for you to understand that any alternative...
By June '86. And then lastly, we'll have the construction completed someplace around September '86. So these basically are the phases that we need to look at in the next couple of years.
I'm sure you've all seen examples that are as bad as the ones that you've just looked at. They are all errors that reflect a lack of understanding about the advantages, the disadvantages, and the rules for using the tools for the presentation of visual information. In the previous program, we talked about graphics in terms of why they're used. We talked about the criteria that the graphics should meet in order to be good for a technical presentation, and we talked a little bit about what kinds of visuals you might use. Now we'd like to shift attention and talk about the tools that are used as a means of presenting those visuals to the audience. Now, before I talk about the tools specifically, I want to make some generalizations or reminders, if you will, about the nature of the technical presentation as we've emphasized it in this series. One, remember that the human being, you, are still the primary conveyor of information. Just as the visuals are used to assist the speaker, the tools are also there to assist the speaker in getting the point across to the audience. Now, remember, anything that makes it difficult for the speaker to get a point across is something that should be avoided. There's a second reminder I want to reinforce, if you will, and that is to talk a little bit about the nature of rapport. A rapport is nothing more than that kind of joining together that a speaker and an audience create when things are really going well. We want to establish the concept that the mind of the audience, the mind of the speaker, are tracking along the same pathway. Anything that interferes with the ease and ability of the human speaker to relate to the human audience also should be avoided. And one last reminder about this series. We have been talking all the way along about an extemporaneous presentation. And remember, by definition, an extemporaneous presentation is one wherein everything that you do is prepared in advance except the words that you use. For the words, you rely upon your natural conversational ability to generate what it is that you want to say. Ideas and everything else are prepared, but words are allowed to flow naturally. Now, with those reminders in the forefront, what I'd like to do is to talk about the tools that are used and also to demonstrate the way in which they can be used well, and in some cases, the way in which they might be used badly. When we start talking about the tools by which you present visuals to an audience, then I think it's probably fitting that we begin with what is the oldest of all of the tools of presentation. That's the chalkboard or the slate board. Literally goes back to the days when they were handheld and shown. And before I get into the detail on it, on all of the tools that we're going to talk about, I want to try to touch on several things. I want to touch, first of all, on what may be the advantages of using a particular tool. I want to talk about the disadvantages of using the tool. And then I want to touch on some of the rules that are associated with how to use them when you're going to use them. Now, let's start then talking about the chalkboard, and let's begin by talking about the advantages of the chalkboard. And I think the first advantage is the fact that it has a certain amount of spontaneity, all right? It's a spontaneous method of presentation. That is, you can, in an audience, you're sitting there, you can watch visuals created before your very eyes. Now, that's kind of neat once in a while when you get someone who's really adept. That is, they're skilled in using chalk, a chalk talk artist, or whatever you want to call it. That's kind of fun, but most people, frankly, aren't that good. And what you end up with is you're watching people draw or write things that might better have been done in advance. Now, there's another advantage, however, to all of this, and that is the chalkboard is relatively easy to use. All you have to do is to be able to write or print legibly, and also to be able to write or print in large enough size so that an audience can see it well. Remember, you're always going to be limited in chalkboard by the distance that the audience is sitting from the chalkboard itself, because that's your limitation. And finally, the chalkboard has the advantage of being extremely cheap. There's literally no raw material cost in producing a visual, with the possible exception of the consumption of a little bit of chalk. Now, those are the advantages, but as you might suspect, there are some disadvantages to using the chalkboard. And I think that the first disadvantage, and a very, very serious one, by the way, is that the chalkboard is basically an awkward tool. You notice the position I'm in, by the way? This is what I mean. You're constantly, every time you write, this is the way in which we write, you're forced always to be turned away from the audience. Now, we talk in terms of nonverbal communication, something we mentioned on an earlier program. We talked about the idea of, eye contact and things like that. Well, in the nonverbal world, we talk about the center of the body, all right? That is the facing point of the body. When you maintain eye contact with someone, normally you also maintain contact literally in that direction. If you walk up to someone, you say, "It's nice to meet you," give them the hand, that says one thing, doesn't it? But if you walk up to someone like this, "Nice to meet you," all right? Notice what that does? You give them the shoulder. Think of what you're doing to an audience, by the way. All the time you're doing this is you're constantly playing peekaboo over your shoulder, or, as some people do, especially in the college classroom, they say, and they do this, all right? And they spend a whole day or hour just writing and talking to a chalkboard. Now, academicians get their kicks that way, but for a technical presentation, remember, it doesn't do anything in the establishment of rapport. Now, another problem with all of this is that it is too slow. Consider what it would be like, for instance, if you had to put some complex material on this thing. It would take forever just to get it presented to the audience. And finally, it's only temporary. Just a minute or two ago, I had all the advantages on the board. In order for me to go to the disadvantages, I had to erase the chalkboard. Now, if you're into technical drawings or technical illustrations or formulas or numbers, you erase to go on, and somebody comes back and raises a question later, where are you? You have to do it over again in order to use the visual, which really means it's not very effective in terms of an extemporaneous presentation. Now, if you do get caught in a circumstance where you have to use a blackboard, let me make some suggestions. One, be as neat as you possibly can, all right? Keep everything as simple as you possibly can. Remember to keep at least a verbal relationship with the audience. That is, if you have to turn your back, okay, you have to turn your back, but talk to them anyway so that there isn't a total breakdown in rapport. The chalkboard, by the way, is not by our definition an extemporaneous speaking tool at all. It is really designed to be used as an impromptu speaking tool. That is, when you're into a presentational situation and someone raises a question, the answer to which is going to involve visualization, that's when it's nice to have the chalkboard. You whip it out and you can do whatever you need to do. But that because everything in an extemporaneous presentation is to be prepared in advance, the chalkboard is almost automatically eliminated. It's a good impromptu tool, but there's a better one, by the way, which we'll talk about later on. But in the long run, just because of the awkwardness of the thing, it does not work well in an extemporaneous presentation. Now, the next step, if you will, in the evolution of the tools for visual presentation was the move toward the charts, the flip charts or hard charts. And I'd like to talk about those next. But in order to do so, I have to kind of rearrange the set here a little bit. So if you'll excuse me for just a minute, I'll be right back. Now, when you talk about flip charts, there's really two ways in which flip charts are used in a technical presentation. Sometimes they are flip charts that you write on. Sometimes they're flip charts that have already been written on. Now, if you're going to use flip charts and write on them as you go along, you haven't really changed anything from what we talked about on the blackboard. Instead of white on dark, you go dark on light, but other than that, it's approximately the same thing. For instance, if I wanted to use this particular news pad in that way, look at what's going to happen, by the way. This is the left-hander's position, by the way. To write on this thing, I'm right back into that same kind of awkwardness that we got involved in when we're using the chalkboard. Now, there is one advantage that is kind of picked up on it over the chalkboard, it's that you have the permanence. That is, you can flip it back and forth if you want to. But frankly, I don't think these things are used well when they're used to write on as you go along. I think instead that it's more important to talk about flip charts in terms of those where the material has already been put on the charts in advance. And that's obviously an extemporaneous speaking tool. And let's first of all talk about the advantages of using flip charts. To begin with, and as I've already mentioned, they can be prepared in advance, therefore they do constitute an extemporaneous speaking tool. You don't have to spend your time in front of the audience writing things out for them. They are permanent, that is that they can be referred back and forth. If you use a visual and you have to go back to it later on, all you do is find it and show it again to the audience. And they're relatively easy to use. Depending again on the level of the presentation that you're at. For instance, the ones that I've set up for this demonstration are the kinds of ones that I think are typical for an in-house presentation where, you know, you don't have a large audience to deal with to start with. It's a relatively informal kind of presentation. It's one wherein you don't want to invest a great deal of money in having these things printed out, you know, and carefully in large type and all the other things that go along with it. It's kind of a quick and dirty, but it can be very effective to use. Now, at the same time that we can talk about the advantages of flip charts, realistically, you've got to recognize that there are disadvantages associated with the flip charts. The disadvantages very clearly are, first of all, the size problems that you get involved in. Size problems in the sense that as you deal with this, you don't have a whole lot of room to work with, remember. And you still get caught up in the situation. Your lettering has got to be large enough to be seen clearly by everybody in the audience. Another problem is there's a lack of control. No matter how well they're done, by the way, you run into problems like I just ran into. The paper, you know, got stuck there and it won't drop, and therefore you have to do a lot of physical manipulation. Every time you engage in a lot of things that are related to the control of the visuals, you end up with a loss of rapport at the same time. Remember, you're still trying to concentrate on talking to the audience. You are the primary conveyor of information. Don't let anything like this interfere with what you're doing. Now, if we're going to talk about all of these things, then let's talk about the rules for using flip charts. Now, before I get into the specific use of these things, I want to make a comment about timing. If you recall, when we talked about the overall structure of a presentation, I emphasized the idea of an introduction, development, and conclusion. Or tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. We kind of picked up on the same idea when we talked about how do you handle information that's presented to a mixed audience, which we said, all right, you give them a generalization, then you move to the specifics, and you go back to a generalization, which is really a modification on tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Now, when you're using visuals, in order to keep a cohesive and smooth presentation going, you're into much the same thing. Literally tell them what you're going to show them, and then tell them what you showed them. But it's the first of those two that's most critical, and that is a smooth move from one visual to another. Now, timing is extremely difficult to talk about in the abstract, so let me see as we go along if I can't demonstrate what I mean by a sense of timing in terms of using the visuals. Now, in the first rule, of using a flip chart is that whenever you have the possibility to do so, to flip down, not up. I don't know why it is everybody assumes that when you have flip charts that you flip them. And flipping means you throw them back over the top of the visual. I don't care what kind of paper you're using, by the way, that's always more difficult to do up than it is to drop it down. I mean, at least you've got the law of gravity working for you, you see, when you come down with them. I hope you noticed, by the way in which the movement of the flip chart and what I was saying was coordinated. I tried for this lettering to appear at approximately the same time I said, move them down, not up. Now, of course, what that means is you have to know what the next visual is going to be. Now, if you're here, for instance, you may have your notes that you're dealing with, but it's very easy to get lost in those kinds of things. I think there's a better way when you're using the flip charts, and that is to literally use marginal notes on the flip charts themselves. Now, I'm pretty sure that you cannot see it as I've gone along here, but in the upper right-hand corner here of each one of the visuals is a word or two that is for me. I can read it very clearly standing here. And what it refers to is what's on the next visual. So that I can say a few things as I'm flipping it, or say a few things as I'm getting you prepared to see what's coming up. That's what the notes are for, is really as a way of giving you a little bit of cohesiveness and an opportunity to kind of prepare the audience for what it is that's coming next. Now, in terms of the physical setup for using flip charts, it's important that you learn to keep to the right. The right in the sense not of the physical right or the directional right, but the correct side of the visual. Now, for me, you'll notice, by the way, I'm a right-hander. Therefore, I'm standing on the left side of the easel because it's much easier for me to use my right hand. If I were left-handed, I'd literally be on the wrong side of the visual right now because I'd be using a non-dominant and not quite as an adept side. And for me, by the way, that's critical because I'm absolutely no good whatsoever with my left hand and I'm only marginally useful with the right hand. So always keep on the correct side. Now, there's another problem that's associated with charts. If you're going to do any pointing at the chart, you have to have some kind of a pointer or something else because everything is done right up here. When you're using a pointer, by the way, on any kind of flip chart or solid material chart, always place the point where you want it to go. Now, time and time again, I have seen people making technical presentations where they've got not a word or phrase visual here, but a schematic or a line drawing or a flow chart or something of that nature, and you'll see them do. Now, this is the critical point right here because it's right at this point where always in the past we've had some problems. So this point is a critical one, and look, what's happening is you're drifting. All right, now you get rockers too. They say now. In the schematic here, notice this particular valve right here because this is the valve where we've had problems in the past. And of course, he's covering 30 feet of piping in the process. Now, if you're going to point to something, point. Do it like that. Now, look what happens for the stability. I can still remain in the center that is talking to the audience. I don't have to pay any attention to the visual whatsoever because I've got that kind of hold placed literally by physically pointing to it. Now, by the way, as an aside, there are some people who ought not to be allowed to hold pointers under any circumstance and for any reason, partly because of any one of a number of frustrations that they have about their living. But if you're going to use these things, be very cautious with them, by the way. Now, the last thing I want to comment on in terms of making the presentation with the set flip charts is try as much as possible to keep everything as neat as possible, okay? Also, it's very, very helpful if you know how to spell and you know how to proofread so that you don't run into circumstances like that. Now, what happens is, first of all, any misspelling, and I've seen them done, by the way, any misspelling that's in a word, you get your whole audience is going to see it. And then they start, hey, look what dummy did there, you know. And there's this reaction going on. Of course, nobody's paying any attention to the speaker. Or what happens is you notice it. You go, oh, excuse me, that's a small problem there. That's the engineering spelling. Whatever your response might be, by the way, you still get into the situation where it breaks up the flow of what's going on. Now, I am not necessarily, by the way, a fan of flip charts. I have used them on occasion merely because it is a convenience at the moment. They are almost an impromptu tool. I think in the long run, other than the relatively informal, quick and dirty kind of in-house presentation, flip charts are not the kinds of things that you see being made in customer presentations or in presentations anywhere outside your own corporation. If you're going to use charts at all in a circumstance like that, it is more likely that you're going to be using hard charts. And that's what I want to talk about next. I'll be back in just a moment. Now, when we talk about hard charts, there's not a whole lot of difference between a flip chart and a hard chart, other than the means by which you remove an old visual and put a new visual on. And they can be a little bit awkward to use. If you have a stack of 10 hard charts to use in making a presentation, everybody has experienced the difficulty associated with how you get one off and get the other on. In general, the hard chart has tended to disappear as a means of presenting visual information in a technical presentation, with one exception. There are times when engineering information, either be on the basis of schedule or on the basis of process, becomes a long, linear kind of thing. Literally, well, the best example I can think of, and the first one I ran into, was to the startup schedule for a nuclear power plant. That particular schedule, as a matter of fact, is about 6 feet high and 35 feet long. Now, that creates an awkward situation if one wants to present or talk about pieces of it at any point along the line. That's when a hard chart becomes valuable, and that's to build some kind of relationship in a horizontal line. Now, I have set up already here some visuals that are essentially the hard chart type. Now, I want to talk about it in terms of how many units of information there are. What is here, for instance, is 1 unit of information. That is, if I use just this easel and presented visuals one at a time, it would never be any wider than 1 unit. Now, if you're making a 1 unit presentation, I recommend that you use 2 easels. Now, why? This material in the front, by the way, is nothing more than a cover card. It's there so that while you're making an introduction to something, people cannot see the visual that you're going to present first. When you're done with all of your comments and remarks and introductions and you're ready with the timing to start showing it, then it's a simple matter to move it forward, reach behind, and pull the visual out. Now, once it's set in position, there you're ready to go. Now, you notice where the focus of attention is. There's still only 1 visual that is being presented here. If one wanted to continue and just use this thing, all you do is reach over, pick up the next one, slide it across, then you'd have a smooth, easy way of covering up a visual and keeping the next one hidden. Now, suppose we talk about a presentation, however, that is 2 units or more in terms of its length. That's what this one is, by the way. This is a workflow diagram associated with the number of steps, phases, and tasks associated with making an infiltration and inflow analysis of a sewer system. And I do want to pay special thanks, by the way, to Donahue and Associates Incorporated, a consulting engineering firm from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who supplied me with these visuals. Now, in this particular case, if you've explained what is going to go on in these tasks, you're ready now to pick up on where this one leaves off. The very simple way of doing it is to move back to easel number 1. Now, that information is not going to be discussed. You've now worked into new material. True, that's going to be in front of an audience. But remember, they've already heard that and looked at it, and rarely do you see people getting distracted in reverse. This is where the distraction would be if indeed we were still talking about step 1. This allows then to talk about the work diagram or the workflow diagram in terms of where it's going to. If this were the end of it, we would have a 2-easel presentation. But in this particular case, the workflow diagram goes on. Therefore, the 3rd easel. And there it is. You see how simple it becomes to literally pull them across until you ultimately end up with a complete workflow diagram beginning over on one side and ending up on the other. Now remember, the reason for doing it in this way is to control the focus of attention and also to relieve you of the physical responsibility of moving hard charts around. These things are clumsy, by the way. They're awfully awkward to handle just by themselves in terms of what are you going to do with it when you're done with it. By leaving it up on the easel this way or by covering it, makes it a very simple process to maintain control of attention, to still physically move it. If, by the way, you started out your presentation with everything laid out this way, the real danger comes is that while you're talking about task number 202, you've got people in the audience looking at 407 and trying to see behind you for the one thing that they're interested in. So this is designed to allow you to end up with a series of visuals that have the horizontal linear relationship, a completed picture that can't be covered in one because of visibility factors. It allows you to control the attention of the audience at all times. It allows you kind of an easy physical way of doing it. Now, there are other tools that we still have not talked about, but because, again, of distraction and other things, I'd like to get rid of these, so I'll be back in just a moment. Now, if we were to continue kind of a chronological development of where visuals have been presented or tools have been used in the presentation of technical information, I suspect that the next one to come up might very well be the overhead projector or possibly the 35mm projector. But both of those are used so extensively and create in both one hand strengths and weaknesses that I'd like to handle both of those in the next show and just talk about those two separately. Now, if we eliminate the overhead and 35mm slide, the next step is to the use of movies. That is, motion pictures themselves, 8, 16, 35mm movies. Now, they, for a time, were relatively common and relatively popular. They have a single advantage over almost any other kind of presentation, and that is they show motion. They literally, you can see things move. And there are times when applications are very important for the use of the film and of showing things in movement. There are so many difficulties with it, however, that it almost outweighs any advantage that might be gained. The disadvantages, I think, are very, very easy to identify. The first one is very simple, and that is that a movie is not a visual aid. It is a presentation. Now, suppose you're the speaker and you're using a movie. What are you doing, by the way? You turn that thing on, and from then on, you're a projectionist. You're not a presenter. You can sit and just, it will roll all by itself, and the audience has watched the movie. What are you doing? You're not doing anything at all. Now, there are times when you might want to use a small portion of a movie, but even so, even room light problems create a difficulty. Every time you're going to use a movie projector, all of the lights are killed, right? And of course, there's a problem there. Darkness induces a state of restfulness on the part of an audience. And sometimes they just kind of flake off on you. The whole concept of a film is really a self-contained presentation. Now, if you do use the film, let me make some suggestions. One, keep them as short as possible. That is, a 5-minute film clip within an hour presentation makes good sense, because for that 5 minutes, I think that's a reasonable use of time for using a motion picture. But remember, the problem we've been talking about is that you always kind of tell your audience what you're supposed to see, then you show it to them. Boy, that is critical when you get to a movie. I was teaching a course at one time, which was Anatomy and Physiology of the Vocal Mechanism. And as a part of the course, I was using a film that was made that shows the vocal folds in vibration. All right? Well, I showed it to my class, and the thing was over, and I said afterwards, now, did you notice the way in which the epithelial tissue of the false vocal folds seemed to be vibrating in an inharmonic relationship to the vibration of the true vocal folds? And they all sat there and said, you said, and we didn't notice it. Now, that was my own stupidity, by the way. I knew what they were supposed to be looking for. I just didn't bother to tell them what they're supposed to be looking for. And I just got stuck in the option that a lot of people get stuck with in using movies. You got to show it over again. Now, I assume that you previewed a film before you show it. If there's something you want your audience to attend to, tell them what it is so that they'll see it when they get there. Finally, once in a while, you're going to find a film that might run, let's say, 30 minutes, but it's got 2 little bits in it, and they're probably, what, 5 minutes each, and that's all you want to use. But instead of showing the whole film, take a scissors and cut out the sections that you want. All right, and then you can buy splicing material and leader material at almost any photo store, splice the whole thing together, get an extra reel, and you can show your 2 little bits. Now, the only recommendation I make is that when you're done showing the 2 little bits, that you splice them back into the original film, especially if it's a rented film. They have a very funny attitude about that sort of thing. Now, you know, I think why you've seen the disappearance of the movie, however, at least in terms of the technical presentation, is because of the advent of a much newer technology, and one that is much more effective, and that's the videotape recording equipment, especially that associated with a Portapack. Now, videotape recording equipment has, I think, tremendous advantages. Now, remember, it still does the same thing, by the way, that the movie does. That is, it shows motion. But it's much easier in the sense that, first of all, it operates without special lighting. Secondly, if you go someplace and carry just a handheld video camera or a unipod, a tripod, a power pack that's portable, you go out to a site, for instance, if you videotape action that you want people to see, you can check it immediately to see whether you got what you wanted. There's no processing time involved. If you got what you wanted, fine, you use it. If you didn't get it, you're still there, do it again. You always have that opportunity to check immediately. Again, because there's no processing time, you can videotape something in the morning and you can use it in the afternoon because it doesn't require any time at all. And then when you're done using it, it's a very simple thing to put the videotape back into the supply camera again, and somebody else can use it over again. And in terms of the presentation itself, it's very easy when you've got something on VTR to have it set in the position you want it to be. You can have all the equipment turned on so it's nice and warm. The time comes to use it in the presentation, you walk over, turn the monitor on, and punch the button, and it will roll. As a matter of fact, you can get them in color. You can get ones that you can hit a pause button, it'll stop and hold its picture. You can rewind, redo, you can do it with audio, without audio. It has tremendous flexibility, and it has one disadvantage. And the disadvantage of the videotape recording equipment is exactly the same disadvantage that we have when we're talking about doing this series on television. We are limited by the size of the television tube. Now, for instance, as you watch what's going on today, depending on how many people are in the room with you, you may find yourself at times so far away from the screen that it's extremely difficult to get the picture. Now, if you really want to get fancy, by the way, you can keep right on going. There's an Advent projector. Sony has a projector that allows you to hook a television picture into one of these projection devices and allows you to get a 6-foot image. And again, as long as you stay directly in front of it, you can get a much larger picture with videotape recording equipment. Man, you know, it's kind of awkward to sit here because I know as I'm talking about VTR, somebody out there is marketing a new device that makes everything I say change. But at the present time, I think videotape recording is a much better way to go than the motion picture. And if there's a circumstance under which you've got to show motion, investigate the possibility of using VTR. And that leaves me with only one more tool that I want to talk about in terms of the concept of presenting visual information. It's rather an unusual one, by the way. I want to talk a little bit about the application of the principles of modeling to the use of technical presentations. Now, I have with me here a small model, or a small portion of a model, a 3/8" scale model, that was provided through the courtesy of the Bechtel Power Corporation in San Francisco. Now, it's not critical to understand what this is a model of, but to understand that it is designed according to some very, very clear-cut standards. The 3/8" scale is always consistent. Equipment that is easily identifiable is scaled. The piping is all colored according to ASME code. The gray is used to indicate structural. The white is used for concrete. The clear plastic is nothing more, obviously, than structural material to hold the model together. Now, how is this used then in a technical presentation? The model itself does not work well for a technical presentation. unless you've got only 3 or 4 people. And then it's a circumstance where you can sit them around and say, I want you to notice this or that, and you can do a little direct pointing. Where it can really be used effectively, however, is in conjunction with other media. For instance, one could use the model in conjunction with the 35mm camera and present some excellent visuals to be used in a technical presentation. When we talk about 35mm, I'll show you some of the slides that have been made from models, and you get an idea how effective it is. It can be used even with VTR equipment. There's a variety of things that can be done, and by translation, it can be used with an overhead also, if you go through the process of making a 35mm first. But those are things I'll talk about in the next show. I think so far what we've done in talking about the tools, part 1, is I've tried to concentrate on literally the non-projection tools. I hope I've given you a better idea of what kinds of choices you have available, the advantages of each one, the disadvantages of each one, some of the rules to follow if you're going to use them. On the next program, I want to concentrate on the tools, part 2, which deal primarily with the two that I think are probably used most frequently. That's the overhead projector, the 35mm slide projector.